Alrighty, welcome back. So this is a new section, not just to you, obviously it's new if you're watching this, but new to the course itself. I added this, it's basically a month right now since I published the course, and I'm adding it because a lot of people have been requesting this topic. There's been a bunch of comments and people have been asking about this, so I decided to add it. And that topic is database triggers. So if you're worried about it, if it seems super advanced, it's actually much simpler than learning some of the earlier topics. Things like joins are much more complicated conceptually. So this is nice and easy. There's just a little bit of new syntax we need to talk about. But before we get there, let's talk about what the heck it is. What are database triggers? They're just SQL statements, bits of code, that are automatically run when something happens, when an event triggers them. So when a specific table is changed. So this is actually really, really useful in certain situations. So I should start off by saying this is not something that you'll be using all the time. Even in a big, if you work at a big company with a big production database, you're not going to have a bunch of triggers. You're not going to be writing this type of code often. So it's not central to using MySQL in any way, but it's a nice thing to know how to do. And when you do need it, it's really nice to have. So again, it's basically SQL code that will automatically run when they're triggered by certain events. So here's the syntax. It's not going to make a bunch of sense just looking at it like this, but here's the rough pattern. So there's this new bit of code, create trigger, and then we provide a name. And the name is not all that important. It's really for your purposes for referring back to it or if you're trying to remove that trigger later on. But you, as always, you want to give it something meaningful. But then we have three really important components: the trigger time, the trigger event, on, and then the table name. And then this syntax for each row, begin and end. So we'll talk about the syntax a bunch more. We'll write some code, but let's dive into these three things: trigger time, trigger event, and table name. Hopefully it will make a bit more sense. So as I said, these triggers run code when a particular event happens, when a table is changed. And these three components are very important to that. So the first one is the trigger time. And there's only two choices: before and after. So do you want this code to run before something happens? Let's say an insert. Do you want this code that you have to run before you insert or after an insert? Then moving on, we have trigger event. There are three choices here. So three changes that can trigger this code to run. We have an insert, an update, and a delete. So you can run some code right before something is inserted into a specific table, or you can run code right after something is deleted. And I'll show both of those examples actually, as well as update. And then table name has basically infinite choices. It's just the name of a table that exists in your database. So we could run some code before you insert into photos or immediately after updating the users table. So whenever that happens, when any single item in the users table is updated, whatever code that we have between the begin and end, and there's a lot of new syntax, I know, so don't panic, we're going to get to that in just a bit. But whatever code you have there will automatically be executed right after a successful update on any item in the users table. And we could do the same thing for delete or insert. So the last thing I'll talk about in this quick intro video is what kind of things would you do with this? And there's really a couple of categories. The first has to do with validating data. And this is a bit controversial, in my opinion as well. I'm not just saying other people think it is, but I actually don't think this is the best use of triggers. But what you could do is enforce specific things on your data. For instance, you don't want to let somebody sign up for your application unless they have an age that's greater than 18. You can actually write a trigger in MySQL to prevent that creation or that insert from happening if the age is less than 18. Now, the reason I say that it might not be the best use is that you could also do that in your application code. So if you have a web app, an iOS app, a computer app, it's much easier to write code that just says, is this age less than 18? Well, then don't even try to insert it into the database. But because this is a course on MySQL, I am going to show you how to do those validations. In fact, it's going to be the first thing we do. And the way that that works is you run code before inserting into a table. So we would have run this code that checks if age is less than 18 right before inserting into the users table. So we'll do that. But then the second category has to do with manipulating, creating, deleting other tables relative to your trigger table. So the example that I'll give that we're going to do, if we have our Instagram data, where you can follow, or any social network really, where you can follow people, you have friendships, it might be useful to actually know when somebody unfollows someone. If we're a company, we want that data. It could be relevant. We could, we could sell it, or it would help us understand when certain ad campaigns backfired maybe, and I started unfollowing, or our users started unfollowing particular accounts. Well, currently, there's no way of keeping track of that. If a user unfollows someone, if they delete their following relationship, essentially, it's gone. What we could do, though, is use a trigger to say, okay, right after a follow is deleted, we're going to create some new row. So you could think of it as sort of logging your history, which is a common use for triggers. So that's just one example of 2 different ways of using triggers. We're actually going to see 3 different examples in this section, but those are the 2 broad categories. So validating your data, and then the second one is manipulating other tables based off of an initial table triggering that action. So I think it will make a lot more sense once we dive into the code. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and create our very first trigger.